Hey guys, Aaron here. Today I'm going to be showing you guys how to replace the rear axle seal and bearing on a 2004 through 2015 Nissan Titan. Now, bad or failed axle seal is actually a very common issue on these vehicles. Nissan's released multiple TSBs regarding the issue, and for the 2004 through 2007 trucks, Nissan has actually came out with an updated axle to prevent the axle seals from failing. So this particular truck is a 2008 with about 250,000 miles on it. We're experiencing some fluid leaking from the driver's side rear axle seal here. So we'll be replacing the axle seal and the axle bearing as well. Now, one important note before you go replacing your axle seals is you need to check the condition of your axle vent. This is the vent right here, and what happens is as the temperature rises in the differential as you're driving, the pressure starts to increase, and air needs to be able to come out of this vent valve right here. And if it doesn't, it's going to find a way to come out, and it's going to come out of your axle seals and cause them to go bad. It's a very common issue. So before you go replacing the axle seals, check the condition of your vent valve. If it's clogged, chances are the reason why your axle seals are leaking is because the air and the pressure is just too great and it rises as you're driving. One common thing to do is to actually install a brass barbed fitting inside here and run a hose up into the bed or up into the frame rail of the vehicle. I have a video on how to do that. It's actually fairly simple, so make sure you check this vent before you go replacing your axle seals. So with all that said, let's go ahead and go over the parts and tools we're going to need to get the job done. So first thing, we're going to need a new axle bearing and race. We're going to need a new spacer, and then we're also going to need a new axle seal as well. I like to stick with Nissan OE genuine parts. I've had some problems with aftermarket seals and bearings before, so I don't really like messing with those. So if you can, stick with Nissan. And then I'm also going to be replacing the snap ring that kind of holds everything on the axle. You don't have to replace it. I just do, just because it's fairly cheap. If something happens to the original, I always have a backup. So just keep in mind when ordering parts, 2004 through 2007 is going to be a different part number than 2008 and newer. That's the updated newer axle. I'll go ahead and throw a link in the description for all the parts and tools that we're going to need here. So as far as tools go, we'll need a 3/8 ratchet. We're going to need a torque wrench, an 18mm socket, and a 1/2-inch ratchet. We're going to need a 10mm socket and some needle nose pliers. We're going to be using a cold chisel, and we're going to need a way to cut the races off of the axles. I'm going to be using a combination of my right angle grinder and my die grinder here. The die grinder is nice because it has a smaller diameter blade and it allows you to get in a little bit closer without damaging anything. And we're also going to need a hammer. One of the more important tools we'll be using is a slide hammer. This kit comes with a couple different attachments for your hubs, gear puller, and stuff like that. There's a race puller that we're going to be utilizing. The job can be done without this. However, it's going to save you a lot of time. So if you have a chance to pick one of these up, or if you have it, definitely use it. Tool that we're going to need is a hydraulic press. It's definitely the most important tool that we're going to be using today, just because of the immense pressure that's needed to press the bearing onto our axle. If you don't have one, you can take your bearing and axle to any reputable shop and they should be able to press it on for you. However, you can purchase one online for a pretty good price along with a slide hammer. I'll go ahead and throw a link in the description if you're interested in purchasing the parts and tools that are needed for this job online. All right, so here we are, tires off the vehicle, and the vehicle is jacked up using a properly rated jack and jack stand. First thing we need to do is remove the rotor and the caliper. We're gonna be removing 2 bolts off of the backside of the caliper using a 10mm socket. Okay, so now that that's done, we need to go ahead and remove the 4 nuts that hold the axle to the differential housing right here. If you have any rust or dirt, go ahead and clean that off the threads. I'm going to be putting some WD-40. You can use any kind of lubricant you want. It just helps these nuts come off a little bit easier. We're going to be using an 18mm socket. All right, so now that all 4 nuts are removed, it's time to go ahead and remove the axle from the vehicle. The axle's pressed in by the bearing, and you can't just simply pull on it and it comes out. I like to use a slide hammer with a hub attachment, and that's what I'll be using today. If you don't have one, no biggie. You can sacrifice your rotor and use it to help it come out. And what you want to do is put the rotor on backwards. Go ahead and put your lug nuts on, and you're going to take a mallet and you're going to go back and forth side to side, and eventually it will separate from the differential housing and come out. But as you can see, this rotor is pretty new, and I don't want to purchase a new one, so I'll be using a slide hammer. All right, so here we have our hub attachment. We're just going to bolt it on. Now let's put our slide hammer on. Now, one thing that you need to note is when the axle comes out, chances are you're going to have a bit of fluid that comes out of the axle tube. So it's a good idea to throw something under there to catch all that. All right, so that was pretty easy with the slide hammer. The axle from the vehicle now. All right, so here is the differential with the axle removed, and as you can see, the race to the bearing stays in there. Most of the time that this will happen, if you get lucky, it'll come out, but it never really has for me. So using the slide hammer again with the race puller, we're gonna go ahead and remove this out. You can try to pry it out. I've done that before. Cut it out if you can, but make sure definitely not to damage the differential axle tube here, or just the axle tube. You want this this new bearing that we have to go in there and sit pretty flush. There we go. There we are. As you can see, with the proper tools, this becomes a pretty simple job. But if you don't have the slide hammer, it can be a little bit more difficult. First thing before we go removing the spacer and old bearing and seal is we need to remove the snap ring right here with some snap ring pliers. All right, so now it's time to go ahead and remove the old spacer, the old bearing, and the old seal from this axle so we can install the new one. A couple ways to do that, but my preferred method is to go ahead and cut diagonally on each one. I'm not gonna cut all the way through. I'm gonna cut just enough to where I could take my cold chisel here and I will strike where I cut, and it will go ahead and crack the metal and allow it to come off that way and kind of unpress itself off. So we're gonna start with this spacer. We're gonna cut diagonally. Again, watch, make sure you don't cut into the axle itself. All right, now we want to go ahead and cut this last piece. This part's a little bit more tricky. I like to use my die grinder because it's got a smaller blade on it. Don't worry about cutting into the axle seal here. Since we're replacing it, I really don't care about it. Just push everything back. And again, we don't need to cut all the way through, just enough to get a nice little groove to get our cold chisel in here and break it in half. All right, so we went ahead and cracked it. Let's turn it over. There we go. hard to see, but there is a hairline crack in there. So let's go ahead and take that off, and our bearing. And what we need to do is we need to inspect the axle itself to see if there's a groove cut in it by the axle seal. If you could feel a deep groove, you probably should go ahead and replace your axle, because chances are it might start leaking again. Even though there is a little groove, I can't even run my finger over it, and I'm not too worried about that because the axle will make that seal pretty good. Go ahead and continue to clean up a little bit, and then we're going to go ahead and throw our new stuff on and press this back into place. All right, before we go ahead and put everything back on and press the bearing onto the axle, it's important to note the direction that we took everything off. As you can see, there's a lip here. We can install the bearing and seal on backwards. We don't want to do that because we'll have to cut off and restart and buy new parts. So let's put everything on, and then we're going to get under the press and put everything in place. All right, so we're all done with pressing our new bearing spacer and seal on. Now it's time to go ahead and install our brand new snap ring, and we're just gonna apply it into the groove. And as you can see, we know that we pressed the bearing and everything up enough because the groove, we could see it right here, and that is an indication that our bearing is installed correctly. Okay, so now it's time to install this back onto the vehicle. Before we do, I'm just gonna put a light coating of grease on this seal lip right here, just to ensure that the axle does go in easily and nothing becomes damaged when we press it in. All right, so now that our axle's in place, let's go ahead and put the lock washers and nuts on, and we're gonna tighten these down to 87 foot-pounds. All right, so we have the brake system back together, and we're about ready to take this thing on a test drive. But before we do, we need to add some fluid into the differential to make up for the fluid that was lost when we removed the axle. To do that, just insert a 3/8 ratchet into this plug, and then we're gonna add fluid until it starts to pour out. Now we're set to go ahead and test drive the vehicle, and that pretty much wraps up this video, guys. Hope this video has helped you out. If it has, please like and subscribe. Make sure to check out the links in the description for the parts and tools I used during this video. Thanks again as always, guys. See you next time.